Hey guys, we are the Latter-day Disciples. Our team is dedicated to helping you boldly live the gospel, recognize the signs of the times, and prepare for the return of our Savior, Jesus Christ. We invite you to join us in our mission through our daily and weekly podcast series, connecting with us on social media, and visiting latterdaydisciples.com. We pray you are enlightened and empowered through this podcast episode. Thank you for joining us. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Latter-day Disciples podcast. I'm so excited today to be joined by Lark Dean Galley. Lark spent 25 years in a corporate career before going out on her own as an entrepreneur. The suicides of her father and son reinforced what she'd been hearing from many of her high-achieving clients, that they felt unworthy and incapable of reaching their goals. Lark went from coaching on the externals to focusing on why each person matters. Lark is a published author, speaker, and trainer, and her goal is to help 100,000 people choose to stay on this planet and step into their greatness. She served a mission in Stockholm, Sweden, taught gospel doctrine for 7 years, and is currently the Emergency Preparedness Coordinator for her stake. Lark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Megan. I so appreciate this opportunity to speak to an audience of Latter-day Saints, because I speak a lot, but it's not usually to this specific audience.
Absolutely. It's going to be a great conversation, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have you. I was telling Lark before we started recording that I've noted that the Lord is having us have some more challenging conversations on the podcast this year. You know, we've had someone come on to talk about the death of their wife. We've been talking a little bit about pornography. We've had an episode on pornography, and it just seems like the Lord really wants to address some of these heavier topics that unfortunately touch many of us and are things that we are hesitant for some reason to talk about in other circles, including and maybe especially church circles. So today we're going to be talking about, Lark, your experience losing your son after he committed suicide, and your father as well. And I just want to preface this by saying that I really think it's important for all of us to approach these topics, to have vulnerable conversations, and to mentally and spiritually prepare in the ways that we can. Not saying that this is guaranteed to touch you in your life, but it is guaranteed that we are all going to face tremendous heartbreak. And so I'm grateful for amazing, strong disciples like yourself who are willing to teach and to share your experiences. So all that said, Lark, I'll turn the time over to you if you wouldn't mind sharing your story with us.
Absolutely. So first, I want to say to all those parents who are thinking right now, this could never happen in my home. That was me. I said that. And I watched my kids, and I thought that I was a good mom. We talked about, all the things that parents talk about, with the exception of one of the number one killers of youth, because I didn't think that my kids would ever succumb to that. And so I want to approach this in a way that helps people to understand that this is real, and this is a huge concern, and that Satan is out there to try to deceive our children, to try to deceive adults even, and specifically our children, just because they don't often have the foundation that they need to understand their value and worth. So thank you so much. And as I mentioned, I speak quite a bit. It's just that I don't often have the chance to talk about some of the spiritual side and the things that I have learned from Heavenly Father. And I'm so grateful to share that. So I just want to start out the story. 3 years before my son died, he was almost 16, right around that age, sophomore in high school. And I was walking down the hall in our house, and I was thinking about my, I'll quote, air quotes here, my favorite topic, which was how my son has upset me today. Because our relationship before he died was not good. We would argue about trifle things. I called it arguing, he just called it discussion, and you can imagine where that went. But I was thinking about how frustrated I was with him. And suddenly this voice came into my mind and it said, he's not the problem, you are. And it stopped me because, and I started arguing with the voice. And I said, no, I'm the parent and I know what's best. And suddenly this vision opened up in front of my mind. And I saw my son and me in the premortal existence. And my son said, Mom, you're going to have a hard time being Christ-like, but I'm going to help you. And I thought, wow, here is a boy who had just told me he didn't believe in God. His name is Christian, and he was sent here to help me be more Christ-like. And I realized that rather than being so militant with him, I needed to approach him maybe as an investigator, trying to help him see the value of the gospel. And so that's where I started to soften a little bit. But our relationship was still very difficult. And then when he was 19, he took his life. And looking back, we didn't see any signs as parents. We didn't know he was struggling. He was a freshman at the University of Utah in the mechanical engineering department, something he had always wanted to do. He had friends, he had goals, he had fun activities he was looking forward to. And yet a few things happened all at once that just suddenly became too much for him to cope with in his, as a 19-year-old. And so at that point, I was devastated. Our whole family was devastated. My father had died by suicide 5 years before my son. And when that happened, I went into a dark hole. I don't remember even functioning for 6 months. I don't know how my kids got fed during that time period. And when my son died, I suddenly started to go into that black hole again. And I realized that if I went into that hole, when I finally came out, my husband might not be there. My other kids might not be there because we were all struggling. Our entire world, everything we knew had suddenly been yanked out from underneath us. And yes, people can say, well, you have the gospel and aren't you happy that you have a testimony of this or that? Yes, that's great, but it still doesn't completely solve all the hurt and pain.
Yeah, not even close, I would imagine. I think that's maybe one of the fallacies that we tend to fall into a little bit as members of the church, because we don't really understand sometimes the true nature of empathy. There's this tendency, I think, when something elicits hard feelings for us that someone else is experiencing, that it's kind of a common reaction where it's like, well, I just want to shut this down. Like, I don't want to feel this. I don't want to imagine, right, what you've gone through. And so because of that, we turn to things where it's like, oh, well, we have the gospel and we know about the resurrection. And so we know that you're going to see your son again someday. And isn't that comforting? And in reality, there are different degrees to empathy. I think that maybe you could say that reaction is maybe the lowest form of empathy, right? Like, people are trying to talk to you, trying to offer some little nugget of comfort. Another way that we approach empathy is by turning it around and making it about us, right? Like, oh yeah, I've had that happen and I felt like this and it was so hard for me. And it's like, well, that's not really empathy either, right?
Right.
That whole idea of mourning with those who mourn and comforting those who stand in need of comfort, I think, is really uncomfortable sometimes, because maybe I haven't experienced what you've experienced, nor do I want to, right? Nor I don't want to even imagine it. And sometimes I think that we would get a lot further in actually achieving that, in loving other people in that way, if we were just willing to say, I can't imagine
Exactly.
how that feels.
I remember before my son's death thinking that I understood empathy. I barely scratched the surface. And now I have such depth of feeling for people They might not have the same experience that I do, but if I see them grieving or in pain or hurting, I feel it. I feel it so deeply.
Yeah, which is a challenging gift, I think, right?
Right.
A gift because that's the essence of what it is to be like Christ, is to be able to sit in someone else's pain and just be there,
And
right?
I'll tell you, sometimes we had people that would stop by and they didn't have to say anything. Sometimes we worry, what will I say? Well, don't say anything. You just stop by and give somebody a hug and just show up. That's sometimes the best gift you can get.
Mm, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So, can you tell us a little bit more of, you know, after this horrible tragedy happened and your son took his life? What you talked a little bit about, this tendency to you just wanted to shut down and you kind of forced yourself out of it saying, I've got to be present for my family. But what were some of the things that you experienced in terms of your relationship with God? Was there anger? Was there confusion? Did you like, I feel like these kinds of situations can often elicit a faith crisis. Like, what was your experience in
Well,
that
I
way?
will tell you prior to this was not one of the hardest experiences in my life, if you can possibly imagine that. I had several things happen. I mentioned my father had died by suicide. My first husband left me 6 months pregnant, walked out on me, never to be seen again, so to speak, right? Um, so there had been multiple things. I grew up with a father who was undiagnosed bipolar. We moved every year, a different school every year. So there had been some things throughout my life. And when 3 years of infertility, let's add that there too, just all of these things. And I'll tell you my first thought when I found out that my son had died. If you remember the phrase from Isaiah, a man of grief. And that went through my head. I'm like, I am a woman of grief. Like, is my life destined to just have these things happen over and over again, this grief of things? But I had remembered, because of the foundation I had back when I was going through infertility, back when my first husband left me, I had an absolute faith that God had my back. I never doubted that because he had already shown up for me so many times earlier in my life. And so I never doubted God. I never doubted Christ. I will tell you that I was furious with my son, absolutely furious. My husband, who was 35 years military, battle hardened. Up to that point, I'd seen him cry twice in our marriage, and one of those was at his mother's funeral. He sobbed for 3 days. I, on the other hand, I didn't cry for a week after my son died. I was so angry. And we look at that and we say, well, that's odd. Well, was it? People show up in grief in different ways. And I was so angry with my son, and our relationship had been such before he died that I was just so frustrated with him. And a couple of things happened in that first week after his death. The first thing was that night, our elders quorum president came over along with our ministering brother, and they came over to give us blessings. And they gave my husband a blessing first, and then they gave me a blessing. And these were men that had known us for years. We had been in this neighborhood for many years. They had known my son since he was born. And this one elders quorum president, he started a blessing. And of course, the way you typically expect is a blessing of comfort. And then he stopped and he said, Lark, you have a very important work to do. A very important work to do. He said it twice. And I'm sitting here, in shock about my son's death. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I have my businesses. I understand that, but how can you be talking about work at a time like this? Because I wasn't even thinking outside the box of my day to day. And over the course of the next week, that's one of the things that had me thinking is, what is my work? What work does God want me to do? Another thing that happened a couple of days after my son's death was I had 3 mothers contact me. And each of these mothers had a teenage child. who had either attempted or had talked about attempting to take their life. And these kids knew my son. And if you're familiar with copycat suicide, that is a real thing. And the moms were very sad for me and my situation, but they were also sad for their children. And that's what propelled me, because I thought, I can't change what happened with my son. This is not about me. Was I a good parent? Was I a bad parent? This is about my opportunity to help these kids. And whether or not they chose to take their life, I couldn't be responsible for that. What can I be responsible for? The one and only thing, which is, am I willing to speak out? Am I willing to risk being vulnerable and sharing my story in the hopes that these young kids will see the value in their lives? And I'm happy to report that those kids are still alive today, and that they actually, at the viewing, they came up and hugged me and my husband because they felt our love. And so I just thought, if I can help one parent not have to go through what we have gone through, then all of it will be worth it.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. It makes me emotional to hear. Um, the burden that is on our kids right now, it's unmatched in all of human history. And I think that there are so many influences and things that parents can't even really control.
Right.
Some
Right.
things that we can, right? Some things
Mhm.
that we can help influence, hopefully. But there are so many things that we can't control. And I think that, the message of who we are and what we are worth, our identity in an eternal scheme of things, as well as right now, right? By virtue of the fact that we are children of God. I've always felt like that's one of the most important lessons that we can ingrain in our kids
Yes,
as much as
absolutely,
possible.
absolutely. Something that happened in that first week also was, I had 3 different people come up to me and say, I have a message from your son. And I was like, okay, I'm open. And all 3 of the messages were the same. It was, tell my mom that I love her. Because if you remember, my son and I, we didn't have that kind of relationship. We were arguing all the time. And it softened my heart. The other thing that the person said, the third person who said that to me, tell my mom that I love her and tell her I finally understand. And that was a key phrase for me, because I had said all through my son's growing up years, I thought, one day you will understand. This is what I would say to myself. One day you're going to understand when, I'm thinking, when you stand before God and you have to account for everything, and what your words and actions, how they impacted me and why I did what I did out of love. And that was the message, tell my mom that I love her and that I finally understand it. My heart softened, and I started to think about him and how we could improve this relationship. Our relationship has not stopped just because he's passed to the other side. I feel him very close to me, and he's helped me in many ways.
Thank you. That's amazing. I get goosebumps when I hear stories like that. And it's one of the benefits, those 3 people who came up to you and said that, thank God for the spiritual work that they have been doing to develop their talents. I don't think we all have quite the same spiritual propensities. Not all of us have those gifts, but those gifts are very real. And so being able to be the recipient of such beautiful truth and so comforting, I imagine. And yeah, to begin to develop that own gift in yourself, right? Of that
Right.
sensitivity to your son and to Christian and his spirit, and to know that influence. What are some of the other ways, you had that prophetic vision experience, where it was revealed to you that one of Christian's purposes in life was to teach you to be more Christ-like? What are some of the other ways that you have seen that fulfilled, or at least in the process of being
Sure.
fulfilled?
Well, It's his death anniversary next week. It will be 4 years. And I look at where I am now, and I could not have imagined where I am now compared to the day he took his life. I just would not have thought that. But as we were going along, I was, in this process, I'm thinking, how can I share the story? What can I do? And it came to me that I should find podcasts where I could be a guest on the podcast and get the message out. And as I mentioned before, most of the podcasts are not, to an LDS audience. And that's why I'm so grateful to be here. And I just share my experiences as a parent and what we can do that way. But I started speaking out quite a bit. And then this crazy idea came into my head that I should write a book. And that was not something I wanted to do. And this is something that my son said to me, once again in my head, Mom, if you choose to write a book, I'll be there to help you. And that's not the way he talked. It was very demanding. Usually it was, Mom, you will do this, or Mom, this is the way it's going to be. And the fact that he would say if, and I think I've come to understand that agency is so important. It is critical. And just the way he would say that, it was so soft and loving to me. And I thought, maybe I could do that. And so over the course of the next year and a half after his death, I started to write a book. And I'm very type A personality, and I thought I would have that done in 6 weeks. And a year and a half later, finally published, because it was a hard book to write. I would take it out, write it for a few weeks, and then I'd have to put it away. And a lot of things came out in that book that I was not expecting. I talked about growing up with food insecurity, with a bipolar father, with the instability that created with this mental health issue that we didn't even know existed at the time. I talked about how then growing up that way with the instability created a desire in me to create more. It's a very much stable environment for my family, for my kids, almost to the point where it was a little bit too much for my kids. I mentioned my husband was in the military, very militant background, the way we raised our kids. This is the way you will do it. You will toe the line or else. And then I talked about my relationship with my son and how difficult it was. And I talked about the grief, the day of going through and finding out that he had taken his life, and how that impacted our family. How, once again, we have to use our agency. All of us are grieving differently. My husband and one of my daughters, they've never read my book, and I have to respect where they are. And whereas they have to respect the fact that I talk about this all the time, because it's important to me, it matters to me. And so that's been a process as well, as the whole accepting other people in their grief. And I will tell you, one of the hardest days in my life was when I published the book officially, because I felt like I lost my son a second time. I lost him the first time physically, and the second time was spiritually, and the second time was harder because I felt him so strongly during the time that I was writing. And he said, Mom, I've got to go. I've got to go help other people who are struggling. And he says, I go and help people who are thinking about suicide, and I try to help them so that they stay in their bodies. And if they choose not to, and they take their life and they cross over, I'm there, and they know my story. They know all about me. And because they see that I have managed to come into the light, they have faith that they can do it too. And while it's hard not to have him with me all the time like that, I'm so proud of him for what he's doing.
As well, you should be. I love your story because it hits on so many, I would say, more doctrinally deep principles about the nature of our spirits and the reality of life after death, and the eternal nature of who we are and what we're doing. What are some of the ways that you feel like your experiences have really expanded your understanding of doctrine, or taught you true doctrine that maybe you didn't know before?
Well, I think as Latter-day Saints, we often feel, or at least I did, that we have a corner on the market when it comes to knowing what happens after this life. We have some great, scriptures in Doctrine and Covenants, that lay out how things are going to be. And I have to laugh because for as much as I thought I knew before my son died, I realized that I knew very little. I know a little bit more, but I realized that we really don't know as much as maybe we think we do. And I'll tell you an example that happened. So after I published my book, it was near Christmas time, and I was feeling really sad because I didn't have that close connection with my son as I had before. And I was kind of dwelling on what I thought the suicide meant for him in his life. And while I did not and never did believe that his soul was damned, I felt that in some way his choices had stopped his eternal progression. And so I was thinking on it, pondering about it, and suddenly his voice came into my head, and he was very upset with me. And he said it just like he would have said it if he had been on earth standing next to me. And he said, "Mom, this did not stop my eternal progression." And I know that it was from him and not from me, because that thought had never entered my head. It was completely foreign. I had no idea that it would be okay.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I think that, yeah, the doctrine that we have surrounding suicide, I think, is spotty at best. And I think that there were some things said, especially in older generations, that um honestly, I don't believe they were true. Maybe there were some elements of truth, but yeah, some also not true.
Right. Well,
Some
it's, it's a mental health issue. And if you haven't experienced that, I applaud you. But I know I have been in some very dark places, especially since my son has died. And I will just say that people that end up taking their lives, they are not in their right minds. They have crossed that natural barrier of self-preservation, and all they want is for the pain to stop. And so I can't judge them. I have so little judgment for anybody anymore. I'm like, who knows what this person is going through? When we see people, just give them grace.
Mhm. I heard something from a friend of mine recently that I would love to get your take on, and just to see if this resonates with you. So we were talking about the nature of our spirit selves and our spiritual gifts, and the fact that we are eternal, intelligent, glorious beings. We attained glory in the previous life, and then we come here to mortality, and there are so many veils put over us. A veil being, I guess I would describe it as a spiritual element that distorts the truth, especially for other people trying to perceive us. We put veils on ourselves sometimes that thwarts how we see truth. But there are also veils that protect us from being discerned. And one of the things that my friend said is that she believes that perhaps one of the reasons that someone would commit suicide is that somehow the adversary has become aware of their true identity and who they were premortally, and the powers that they had, and the ways that they opposed him, and the covenants that they made with God. And that in perceiving that, in seeing through those veils, the adversary then goes to work to do absolutely whatever he can to destroy them.
Yeah, absolutely. Shortly after my son died, a couple weeks later, it was the April conference 2019. And Elder Bednar gave a talk about the ways that Satan is working on people to cloud their vision and to steer them off the path. And he didn't say this specifically, but the Spirit whispered to me, and suicide is one of those ways. And I feel that he is using every tool, and he's pulling the suicide tool out, and it is rampant throughout our society, especially our kids. I mentioned that I parent differently now. Very militant before, and now I see myself as a parent to love and guide my children. They don't need a judge. They're already being judged in the world. They need to know that no matter what happens, that they can come to me and I will be there in love to help and guide them. And so I would just think of parents as you're thinking of your children. What if your child comes to you and says, I'm gay, or I'm pregnant, or whatever they might say or do? I've come to understand that love means more than anything else. And instead of micromanaging my kids, they're adult children now. My youngest is 22. I don't micromanage them anymore. And my prayers are, Heavenly Father, whatever path they have to travel to get back to you, I will support it. I've also come to realize that eternity is a very long time. And none of my kids are active. One of them doesn't even believe in God, which shocks me because I'm thinking, you were raised in my home and you didn't believe this. And I just realized that eternity is a long time. And I have so much love for these children that I'm just going to love them. And that's my role, is to try to help them as best I can. Something else I wanted to mention to parents who sometimes feel that maybe their kid might be a lost cause, or what can they do? If you had asked me a week before my son died, which of my children was farthest from the Savior, I would have said, oh, it's that boy right there. A week after he died, who would I have said is closest to the Savior? And I would have said, it's that boy right there. So we can't judge what path God has for them. We don't know. We're just here to be a part, to support them along the way.
Thank you for sharing that. It really resonates with me, especially the idea of, as challenging as this is, right? This is way easier said than done, just loving your kids. Mine are little right now, and they're really cute, and that's a good thing because, wow, it's hard and it never gets easier. um, but as you said that, the thought that I had is just that is the true pattern of God. I was talking to actually someone that we did a podcast with a couple weeks ago prior to recording, and I had made a comment about something, and I was kind of facetiously saying like, oh, I think the Lord is displeased with me. And what he responded was so profound. He said, the Lord is never displeased with you. He's like, think about your little 2-year-old. And if they're playing on the curb and they fall down and they scrape their knee, and maybe you had told them not to play there and they had done it anyway. Like, are you mad? Are you angry? Are you so displeased with them? No, like, you love them. They're your baby. And when we're in this mortal state right now, when we have these veils, we have our natural selves that are pulling at us. We have the added bonus of the adversary, which is unique to our world. Woohoo. We got that added bonus. I actually think it might be a reward in some ways for valiance and for faithfulness premortally. But we have all of these influences. And our heavenly parents are looking at us and they just want to love us. We're just their babies. And so really stepping into that kind of parenting, I think, is one of the best ways that we can really become like our heavenly mother and father.
Right. And it's a way for you to experience much more peace than trying to take away your children's agency or dictate or be a judge and say, this is the way it is. I think back on past generations, we would try to force conformity through shame or ostracization. And that is not God.
Hmm. I do think that that is something that my generation has um kind of figured out a little bit,
Mhm,
that I think is a really good thing.
mhm,
I think sometimes we take it to extremes.
mhm.
Whereas like older generations never gave you a choice, and now we give you a choice about everything, even things that are not a choice.
Right.
So like we've kind of flip-flopped a little bit. But I do think that there is more emphasis on encouraging a child's agency. And that's really important to understand too, is that the not giving agency, that's Satan's way.
Right.
And so
Absolutely.
when you see yourself kind of falling into that pattern, you can know pretty assuredly what sort of influences you're acting under.
Right. Even if you think you're the parent and you know what's best.
Mhm.
Seriously, like I did.
Right. I think I literally said that sentence to my son at some point today.
No, and I understand
Granted, he's
because
2 and he was yelling at me, so I had to tell him. But still,
no,
yeah.
I understand it. Like you say, it's easier said than done, but it's a practice, right? Um, as I mentioned before, I really do feel like my son has helped me become more Christ-like. Just to paint a picture, before my son's death, I was very A-type personality. Had to do the best, be the best, everything. I was a great box checker. I took the whole develop your talents to an extreme and just I did what I was supposed to do, but I also did it in a very box checking way. And I feel that now I slow down. I take time for things that really matter. The externals and what we as a human beings pursue often, those things don't matter to me. One thing, a blessing that I think COVID hopefully gave the people the opportunity to learn is to slow down and to put emphasis on those things that matter most. And I feel like that was a gift that God offered the people if they were willing to see it and learn from it versus speeding up their life again. That's the one thing that I've learned is that I have weeded out a lot of things that just don't matter in life. And I've tried to focus on what matters most. And the rest, I, I don't spend time on it.
That's great. Yeah, I hope that we have allowed COVID to be an awakening experience in as many ways as the Lord will let it be for us, right? Because I think that it could be. I think it could be a catalyst, but not if we forget those lessons, as you said. Not if we are racing back literally to all of the things that we wanted and couldn't do before
Exactly.
that time. I don't think that that was the purpose. I think that COVID really is meant to be, um, was meant to be a kind of a final wake up call,
Mhm. No, I
as you
agree.
said.
I agree, right? It we went through kind of our COVID lockdown the year before when our son died. We just stayed home for the most part. We hardly went out. We were just so devastated and really focused and recentered our lives. And I saw in people in 2020 that they had that opportunity if they would take it to recenter their lives. And some did and some didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a shame. It's the human in us, I think, and it's the pull of the world. It's the
Mhm.
pull of Babylon. It's strong.
It is
Uh,
strong.
and we can't counter it by ourselves because our natural selves want it.
Mhm.
And
Right.
so it really is a process of submitting to the Lord and letting him be the one to
Mhm.
change us. And
Mhm.
adversity and suffering are a part of that. They're a part of that equation. Can we talk about that a little bit? Speaking perhaps, well, maybe we can come at this from a couple of different angles. First off, looking back prior to your son taking his life, what were some of the things that you wish you had known, either about him or just to prepare yourself and your family to go through something that was so traumatic?
First of all, I wish I had known how relevant how knowing about suicide was. I wish I had known how much impact it's having on our families more than I even knew. Even though my father had taken his life, I still didn't see that it could have any impact on my children. I wish I had known that. I wish I had checked in with my kids more. How's, instead of just saying how was your day, which every kid is going to say fine. I wish I had talked more as, what was the best thing that happened today, or what was a hard thing that happened today, and be able to help them understand their emotions, the ups and downs. I wish I had had conversations, which I had actually right before my son died. I finally was moving into, terrestrial parenting mode, where I was getting their feedback and asking how they would have liked things differently in the home, and actually giving some credence to their idea of how the rules should go and what they should be allowed to do. And I wish I had done that earlier, because kids are going to do what they're going to do. Teenagers, you think you have all the rules set down and they're going to follow them, but they are really going to do what they're going to do. And so I wish I had gotten more input from them, not been so forceful about, yes, you will go to church. Yes, you will go to seminary, and allow them a little bit more agency and choice in that, which is very scary,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, it really is. Well, and I think that it might be a misunderstanding of what our stewardship really is meant to be over these kids. Like we love them and we want what's best for them, but I think we also feel the pressure of knowing that we're accountable for them. And so you kind of have these opposing ideas that are playing against each other, and it can very easily turn out to be very negative, as you found out, where it's like, I love you and I'm accountable for you, and therefore you are going to do what I say or else, right?
Right.
So yeah, much more challenging to loosen the reins um and to give them some agency. But I really love the example that you gave of taking their feedback and having a conversation with them. Sometimes I think that our kids surprise us. There was a situation that we became aware of a couple of weeks ago where a mom was feeling some conflict because her 7-year-old had been asked to give a talk in primary. And she does that very regularly, like every 5 weeks, they have a rotation. And she had always said yes. And this one time she said, I think I'm going to say no this time, but I will next time. And it like automatically kind of causes this crisis moment where you're like,
oh no,
I want to give them, I know, where you're like, I want to give my kid their agency, but also like, I want to teach them the importance of accepting callings and accepting invitations and listening to your leaders. And in my head, a little bit, admittedly, I was like, it's a talk in primary. She does it all the time. It's not that inspired, but still, like it can elicit those emotions because we are so invested. We want to teach our kids. We love them. And we want to set them on the path. Right. And so the family was all kind of chiming in and saying, well, maybe here's what you do about it. You make her do it, or you don't make her do it. Most of it, I think, was you make her do it. And I was talking to my husband and I was like, why don't we just ask her why she doesn't want to? Because she's smart. Like, she's 7, but she's a brilliant little girl. And the way that she was so careful with her words, I'm like, I think she has a reason. I think she has, like, there's some background to this, what she's saying. And so my husband suggested that, and the mom went back to her kid and asked her. And what the kid said was so profound and so sweet. She said, there's this other boy in primary and he never gets the chance to speak. And I want him to have a chance. And so I want to give him this turn, and then I'll take my turn next time. And I was like, how incredible is that we're looking at this little girl, we're looking at our kid, and all we see is, you're not doing what I want you to do, or what I feel like you should be doing. When in reality, she was living a higher law.
exactly.
Like, she was trying to serve. She was trying to be Christ-like. Like, she was seeing other people and wanting them to have spiritual experiences. it was so amazing. And I was like, this is so great. And then it becomes a non-issue because you're like, okay, well, maybe because they asked this time and church is tomorrow, maybe you give the talk this week. And then after church, we'll go up and talk to the primary president and say, hey, we really want this little boy to have a turn. And she presented that to her daughter, and her daughter was great with it. She was like, okay, awesome, we'll do it. And so I love that idea of treating our kids and treating everyone like they're human and like they have thoughts and feelings and reasons for why they're doing what they're doing.
Absolutely. I think we can learn a lot from our children if we're willing to let them lead us sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so from here, I would love to just talk about, you've made a living out of this. You've made it your life's mission.
Yes.
Um, well, the Lord made it your life's
Yeah,
mission. You
exactly.
you agreed to it beforehand. Maybe not exactly what you would have signed up for earlier in your life, but this is your mission. This is what you came here to do, and you share a lot with parents, and I imagine also teens who are struggling and things like that. What are some of the things, what are some of the keys that you share? And feel free to put a spiritual spin on it, right? Because that's what we're here for.
Yes.
Um, to approaching adversity in a way that will allow our suffering to sanctify us and not destroy us, because it can really go either way.
Right, right. I would say, you have got to have that foundation in God and in Christ and a knowing. And if you don't know that, then do the things that you need to do to prepare for what is coming. For me, I spend time in the scriptures. I listen to a lot of podcasts, specifically, gospel doctrine, gospel related, because and I'm always praying. I'm like, please bring me new information because I am so curious. I want to learn and I want to spend my time on those things that are higher and better. And if I end up watching a movie, maybe with my husband or something, and I can feel that some of these movies that are put out there, that it's taking the spirit away from me and it's contentious. And so I'm actively removing things from my life that don't serve me, that don't serve my spirit. And I'm actively moving towards things, serving other people, seeing the need, even if it's a kind word or a hug or something, trying to take the time that I didn't take before because I was so busy achieving all of my goals that I thought, were so important. And now I see that the goal in life really is to be kind, to see other people, to love them, to, I keep coming back to this, to honor their agency and to not judge them. And all of those things are super hard to do. And it's so funny because sometimes I'll be out doing different things and interacting with other people, and that ego can sometimes come up, and I'm like, oh yeah, we don't do that anymore. And I have to remind myself, lead with love, lead with love. And whenever I can just step back, take a breath, and I'm like, oh yes, I'm leading with love. And my peace inside me is so much better. The trust that I have for the Lord and his plan. Um, would I have ever thought that I would be here? No, but I also know that it might not have come at any other price. This trust and this to know Christ. I am Christ-like because of what my son has done. And I feel that I need to honor his choices and honor what he has, the gift he has given to me. And I feel like we're working together to share this message that every life matters. And it is so important for people to stay on this planet. And it might be hard today, but it will get better. And you have something that only you can do. And if you're not here to do it, somebody else is going to miss you. It's so important. And so I just have to say, yes, it's been a hard road. Yes, it's still hard. And there are days when I don't know how I'm going to make it. And I just have to breathe and say, just today, just get through today. And then I go out and I share the message and I serve and I try to help other people. And that's what gives me the strength to go on.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that the spiritual preparation that you work through is what you would share for addressing and preparing for adversity, because I mean, really, what else is there? Right?
I was recently called as the stake emergency preparedness specialist, and it was so funny because in October, I started having these very strange thoughts. Like, oh, you need to plan for long-term water allocation if something goes wrong, or you need to do things for power, like solar panels. And I'm like, I live in a condo. This is feasible. And then a couple months later, I get called to be the emergency preparedness specialist for the stake. And in the blessing that I was given to set apart, it was very interesting because the counselor said, we'll give you the power of revelation to help the people in our stake. And I think a lot, I ponder a lot. And so I'm like, well, what does that mean? And I've been thinking of all the spiritual preparation that I've done and all the things that I've been doing to get ready for whatever God has for me. And I thought, you know what? This calling is not so much about preparing the people physically. It's preparing them spiritually for what they need, where they need to be spiritually for what is coming.
Amen, sister. That's what this podcast is about. When I started it, I think I've probably shared this. People are probably rolling their eyes hearing this again. But like when I started this podcast, I thought it would have more of a temporal spin. I thought it would be more, these are the signs of the times, these are the prophecies, and these are what we can do to prepare. You get your water and you invest in gold and whatever.
It can be gone in a moment. Yeah.
I would never say invest in gold. That was just an example, right? Like those are the things that people tend to think of. And the Lord showed me, foreshadowing by the very first episode I ever did, which ended up being way more prophetic and profound than I had any idea at the time. It was called What Made the 5 Virgins Wise, and what's the single most important thing we can do to prepare for the second coming. And the answer that I shared, spoiler alerts if anyone hasn't heard it, is that we have to know Christ. We have to know him as intimately and as literally as we possibly can. And there's a way to do that. But I mean, at the end of the day, water is going to run out.
Right.
Even if you have 5 years worth of water storage, or it's going to get contaminated, or it's going to get dirty, or you're going to have to leave and you can't carry 5 years worth of water with you. Like those things ultimately are not going to be sufficient, because they're not supposed to be sufficient, because we are supposed to come into Christ,
right, and rely on him,
be dependent completely on him and on nothing else.
I was thinking of all the disasters that are supposed to come, and one of them was, like in Salt Lake with the earthquake, and I thought of my adult daughter that doesn't live with us, and she's on the west side of the valley, and suddenly I had a thought, well, what if she's caught in this, and then I'm thinking, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, she could die, and then what would happen? Well, then she would be with Heavenly Father. So it's actually not the worst thing. I know most people don't think like that. I just realized, like, dying is not the worst thing that can happen. We are really not that far away from our loved ones who have passed on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the same thing. I think that the worst thing that can happen is to not be prepared to meet the Lord.
Right.
Whether that be via death or another mechanism. That's really the worst thing. And so, but as we talked about before, spiritual progression doesn't end at death. And our God is so merciful that even those who might not be ready as soon as they die, I don't think it's a problem. I don't think that the veil of death is the one that we remove to see the Savior. I think that that's a different veil. And so if that's the case, the veil of death is just the veil of death. And you go to the other side and you pick up where you left off. And I think it'll be different. I think it's probably harder in some ways. I think you have different responsibilities and obligations and opportunities and restrictions and things. But it's not the end. It's not the
Right.
end of that progression at all.
Not at all. And even as I mentioned before, your relationship with a loved one who has passed on can go on. And I still feel my son. He still guides me. He helps me. Whenever I talk about him, it's like testimony meeting for me, because I just feel the Spirit so strongly testifying that these spirits go on. This is not the end. Suicide is not a lost cause. Through the atonement of Christ, what is the only sin that cannot be forgiven? And it's not suicide. So we still have lots of hope.
Absolutely. Well, Lark, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your story. You're very strong, and grateful for the spiritual gifts that you've cultivated and for your willingness to share them, for answering that call that the Lord gave you to do something hard, to bless other people. And we've been blessed by that today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Love this episode and the Latter-day Disciples mission? You can show your support by rating and reviewing, sharing this episode with a friend, checking out our volunteer opportunities on latterdaydisciples.com, and donating to our cause. 100% of donations are used just for the purpose of covering our operating expenses. We take no money in our own pockets. Your support is invaluable to us, no matter what form you choose to show it. Thank you for being our fellow disciples of Jesus Christ. There are great days ahead for those who love the Lord, and we can't wait to share them with you.